How often do you read a story, where a character has a tragic backstory and that is all that defines them, from their actions to their progression and interactions with other individuals around them? Or how often do you read a story where someone's tragic backstory is used as justification for their actions towards another individual or group of people? I don't know about you, but I've read just about enough stories about heroes seeking to get revenge and that is all they have going for them. Just big balls of anger, angst, and depression. Well, in this video, I want to highlight how Chainsaw Man uses tragic backstories in a way that doesn't come to completely define a character and isn't used as an excuse for why they might do something terrible or morally questionable. Of course, there are examples of characters who do fall into this trope, but they tend to be short-lived antagonists or characters who are swiftly removed from the core of the plot so as to allow Fujimoto to focus on a more interesting way of displaying these characters, from how they are initially formed by their history and how they move on and walk into a future separate from it without forgetting where they came from. One of the greatest strengths of the way Fujimoto handles a character's backstory, particularly those who have a tragic one, is that he gives those characters a certain amount of time between when the tragedy occurred and when they first appear in the series, thus allowing characters to have already experienced growth from the initially catalyst. This in turn allows Fujimoto to create a distance from the tragic event itself, whereas a character who has recently had a traumatic event occur to them is almost always requiring that their attention be on that, lest they appear either uncaring or otherwise out of character, which means that it can be hard to move them away from that trauma without resorting to drastic measures, which may see fans being turned away from it in exchange for altering the trajectory of the character. But by having this blank period, in which the characters have dealt with, accepted or have otherwise internalized their trauma, it allows Fujimoto to skip the needed measures and give himself much more freedom to explore with their characters. If you have your own thoughts on how Chainsaw Man handles tragic backstories in the series, I'd love to hear it. Having a discussion with people about writing styles, character analysis and interpretations is something I want to foster in the Chainsaw Man community as much as I can, even with my relatively limited reach. But with that said, I'd like to give some examples to back up my prior claims, focusing on the three main protagonists of the story, Aki, Power, and Denji, each of which have varying levels of tragic backstories and none of them are defined by them even at the very beginning of the series, and by the time the final chapter rolls around I'd happily say they have all moved on past them. Starting off with Aki, his backstory is one which initially you might take for granted as just being another cliché. Hero's family dies so now he must go out into the world and seek vengeance upon their murderer, avenging their deaths with all the possible emotional drama and moody teenage antics that are super common in all types of anime and manga, especially those who are targeting the shonen demographic. Let me remind you, for those of you who don't remember or just want a refresher on Aki's backstory, he lived with his family in some place, it's not important where. He didn't have the greatest relationship with his parents because they paid so much attention to his brother, and he didn't have the greatest relationship with his brother because of that. Well, one day, when he finally decided to make a move to rekindle or improve his relationship with his brother, and their parents both died courtesy of the Gun Devil's previous rampage, completely blown away along with his house and seemingly all traces of his life prior to that moment, robbing him of the chance to make up for his actions with his brother, preventing him from ever rekindling the bond he could have had with his parent and leaving him with nothing but regrets piled on top of regrets. That's the most basic recap possible for Aki's backstory, and you'd be forgiven for thinking that he was going to end up as some emo revenge-chasing guy who'd stab his friends in the back for a chance at vengeance or at the least would put his revenge ahead of his friends for a considerable amount of time. Following on from this, we get a short amount more of his backstory, how he met Himeno and initially became a devil hunter. Of course that's not really playing into the tragedy angle outside of the fact that he has a contract with a devil which is rapidly depleting his life force, which once again you'd be forgiven for thinking this would make him even more revenge-obsessed, as he is effectively on a time crunch to accomplish what he has set out to do. but in actuality it's the opposite, but I'll get into that when I talk about his self both at the beginning of the series and at the end of it. But safe to say, while the way it was done might be unique, Aki's circumstances aren't all that special when compared to your typical shonen protagonist, but the way in which this affects or doesn't affect him most certainly is. At the beginning of the series, we see an Aki who is both independent of his backstory and yet is still tied to it. We see an Aki who has, or at least is in the process of, finding things other than revenge which fill his heart, something that a lot of other characters who are of the same vein as him take entire stories to accomplish. We see this with how his relationship with Himeno, whom has been his mentor and buddy for at least a couple of years by the time the story of Denji rolls around. Himeno can be given a huge amount of responsibility for helping Aki go through the character growth that we never truly got to see, and is what allows him to quickly form a brotherly relationship with Denji, even going as far as to attempt to save the Chainsaw Man's life when the time comes. Aki also takes Himeno's words to heart, even beyond her death, which to me quite handily displays the fact that he isn't being driven solely by a need for revenge at the start of the series. Also, Aki, despite having lost everything because of a devil, and attempting to harden his heart in response to that affair, declaring he could never be friends with a devil, he is not able to actually solidify that resolve, signaling once again that while his history helped to form him into who he isn't relying upon it to help make all his future choices for him. The most defining trait which separates Aki from his history at the beginning of the series, is his willingness and lack of genuine malice towards either Denji or Power, two people who represent that which he should hate most of all, devils, and they are both forced upon him in a manner which would make most people at the very least a little annoyed, but given the circumstances, many other anime characters might jump to violent or extreme measures to be rid of them. As while Aki does attempt to convince Denji to leave using brute force initially, he never goes for the kill and never attempts to seriously harm either Denji or Power, which honestly might be more impressive given the latter being a true devil and having already shown herself to be treacherous and quite the troublemaker. Yet Aki still isn't able to bring forth any sort of malice towards her. Aki's lack of genuine malice and hate, even when dealing with matters relating to the gun devil, in my eyes shows that despite the trauma, he isn't going to let that define his life going forwards, and that he is an adult who is moving forwards without worrying about what might lay behind himself, because he can't change it. Now moving on to Aki's progression throughout the series, progression which finally cuts the cords from his past and truly allows him to move forwards without trying to take charge of or make up for his past, and instead focusing completely on the present and the future. The most obvious showing of the fact that Aki's tragic past is no longer an element that restrains his character, is when he attempts to remove himself, along with Denji and Power, from the firing line of the gun devil, effectively giving up on what till the beginning of the story, was supposedly his main goal in life. And I don't know about you, but there are few characters in shonen who I can think of who have a tragic backstory, like the one Aki has, and are both willing to and actively trying to give up on their revenge. For most cases they either go too far seeking it and are forcefully snapped back by some other character, they achieve it and then are forced to find something else to take their attention, or they are accepted warts and all, with their comrades coming along for the ride, because they are friends or whatever, despite the fact that said revenge could get them all killed and the one seeking it doesn't care enough about his current life to give up on the pain from his past one. The moment which solidified Aki's complete severance from his past for me, to become someone with a new destination, is when he begs Makima to give him the strength, to grant him a pact with whatever devil, not to strike down the gun devil but to help Denji and Power survive the oncoming calamity. In this moment Aki leaves his guilt, his regret and every other negative aspect of his tragic history behind to instead focus on his future. It is however unfortunate that we never get to see that future because of Makima's machinations, but what can you do? Moving on to Power. Power's backstory isn't one which gets as much of a shine as say Aki or Denji, who both receive considerably more time dedicated to unveiling their backstories. However, Power's backstory is no less tragic or tied into what her character is, and yet separate from what she will become down the line. For a brief recap on Power's backstory, we have the fact that she is a fiend. What does that mean, you might ask? It means a devil who has fused with the corpse of a human and has reanimated it, keeping it alive in a sense, yet at the cost of a sort of merger between the mind of the devil and the human. This merger, and the percentages of each which are affecting the other depends on, at least according to the violence fiend, the amount of human brain which is left intact after the merger occurs. So, we are off to a good start there. Power, the original blood devil, gets messed up to the point that it needs to merge with a human corpse to continue living, thus causing it to lose part of itself in exchange for its new vessel. Then we learn that, Power before meeting her cat considered all lives to be equally pointless, even her own, only continuing to exist because she, naturally, didn't want to cease being who she was as an individual. Power's tragedy isn't having something taken away from her as with the case of Aki, it's the tragedy of not having something to begin with. It is the tragedy of never knowing love, of never knowing friendship, of considering yourself and everyone else around you as expendable, because to you, in the end all people are, is bags of meat and bones. Of course, Power does get some development, even within her own backstory, when she starts to develop an attachment to her cat, only after once again Fujimoto making use of this blank period where this relationship was built and Power was able to begin taking note of the value of things, beyond their ability to either sustain her or give her some sort of immediate gratification. Yet despite that, Power is still someone who, even if not showing it for the most part, is lacking value in things, including herself, owing to her tragic backstory of how she came to be and how she lived for so long, yet she doesn't allow that to define how she'll act moving forwards, putting value on every action she takes, even if she herself doesn't truly consider them valuable, hence why she can so easily cast away one measure of glory and success for another. And now, before I begin talking about Power at the beginning of the series, I'd like to ask you to go down into the comments below and tell me who you think has the most tragic backstory in Chainsaw Man. I'd personally consider Kobani's car to be one of the most tragic characters in all of fiction, but that's just me. But getting back onto the topic at hand, at the beginning of the series, Power isn't obviously showing signs of her tragic backstory. She of course wants to get her cat back. But other than that, she isn't truly showing off signs of lacking worth or lacking a sense of worth in other people and herself, at least not outwardly. However, the fact that she continues to easily toss away friend and foe alike certainly continues to point that while she isn't actively being controlled by her past, nor does she have a goal which originates from it, she is still being affected by it come the beginning of the story, although to a much smaller degree than she was during her first showing in the timeline. Once again helped by the blank period we have from the latest point we see Power in flashbacks up until the beginning of the series rolls around, allowing for her to go through some independent growth apart from the audience's eyes. Honestly, there isn't much to get into with Power at the beginning of the story, with regards to her backstory, outside of saying that she's doing a good job not actively allowing it to motivate her while also still being indirectly influenced. Now, speaking upon her progress throughout the series, it's most prevalently displayed when, after being revived, she, instead of handing Denji over for the sake of Makima's praise, she instead attempts to save his life by fleeing from her. Even then she is questioning why she is doing it, calling back to her own tragic past, before completely breaking free from that as she declares that Denji is her friend and thus, he is worth fighting and potentially dying for. This is one of the best ways I have seen for a tragic backstory to be used, not to shackle a character but to instead provide them with a concrete base from which to draw upon and then later be used as a springboard for them to develop in a way that isn't defined by it. I really don't have anything else to say about it other than Fujimoto is a genius at understanding that the past doesn't have to restrain a character's future and in certain circumstances can be completely turned on its head for the sake of the story and for the character's developing arc. And now for Denji, our main boy in the series. Honestly, I've already done an analysis video on Denji and his goals and why they are great, so feel free to go watch those two videos if you want to hear more in-depth thoughts on how I feel about Denji's character, but safe to say that despite his horrible history, not once does Denji allow it to shackle who he wants to be, or what he is aiming for, even if he didn't believe it was possible before when he was trapped in dead hell. He never stopped dreaming, and once he got out of it, he never stopped looking forwards, not allowing himself to be dragged down by guilt or responsibilities. It took Makima going to extreme lengths to crush his will to even get close to breaking him through his tragic past, which in of itself shows that just because his life was terrible, that isn't all there is to him. I'm sure that people are going to disagree with me on this, and I know for a fact that certain people like seeing people go through the depressing phases of their tragic story. Some people like watching as a character is completely defined by their origin, but I personally don't find that as enjoyable, because I don't think someone continuously being driven by something that happened in their past, even if it was something utterly horrific, terrifying or cruel, to be all that interesting of a character hook or realistic. People change, priorities change, and people who stick to one goal to the detriment of all else because of guilt, regret or any other sort of negative emotion aren't characters which are to be praised or venerated. They are to be pitied for their lack of humanity and ability to grow and move forwards with their lives. But that's all just my option. I might be completely wrong, and I'm sure if I am, people will tell me about it in the comments, but even if you did agree, I'd like to hear your own thoughts in options. If you found the video to be informative or enjoyable, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the like button to let everyone know just how you feel. But regardless, I have been the Anonymous Sweeb, and I wish you a good day or night wherever you may be.